We were talking about the famine. Yesterday was National Famine Commemoration Day. There was a commemoration ceremony in Skibbereen. Anyway, on the line is one of the people who were at that ceremony in Skibbereen yesterday, Brian Hanratty, CEO of Gorta. Good afternoon, Brian.
Good afternoon, Seán.
I suppose, given what you do for a living and having been in Skibbereen at the weekend, it must have been interesting for you to visit a place where the famine hit it in such a devastating way, but it still is 160 years ago. Is it now just a historical event, do you think, or is the residue of it, if you like, still there?
Far from it. I'm speaking to you from the West County Hotel. It's directly opposite the Skibbereen Heritage Centre, and it's one of, I suppose, the few heritage centres in Ireland. Jim Caleary has one in Strokestown, and there's also another centre down in Johnstown Castle in County Wexford, and there are others, but those just come to mind. But here in Skibbereen over the weekend, I have to say the people of Skibbereen did the people of Ireland proud, because they effectively remembered the famine on behalf of all of us. And when you look at the what was the greatest humanitarian disaster for the Irish people, the Holocaust, if you like, our Holocaust, in the 19th century, it was probably the most devastating famine experienced in Europe, right across the 19th century, or indeed probably beyond Europe, you know. And I would say to you that still down here, talking to people, there is still a very strong emotional tie. This isn't, the famine isn't just something for the history books. And in fact, some people locally remarked to me that almost in a sense, the event yesterday would bring in a sense closure to some families.
There'd still be a folk memory there and a familial connection with it.
Very much so, very much so. And I mean, that was reflected yesterday in the official ceremony. Eamon O'Keefe officiated. But, you know, you had local people like, say, the Skibbereen Famine Commemoration Committee. You had the mayor of Skibbereen. You had all these people and reading from contemporary events, which really, again, just helped remind us just how devastating it was, you know. And then over the course of the week, finishing last night, the Theatre Society had a play, The Flight to Gross Eel, which again brought home the human tragedy and going to the new world, and just, I suppose, going out of desperation, and so many people not making it because the ships were in such poor condition that they sank, or people died from disease on the way, or when they arrived in, say, for example, Gross Eel in Canada. So all of that really was brought to life. And again, you know, I have to say, I'm hugely impressed by the effort that the people locally put on. And I would certainly say to your listeners, wherever they are, you know, at some stage, make a point of coming down to Skibbereen, see the Heritage Centre, see the mass grave. There are, I think, 8,000 or 9,000 souls buried in the cemetery just outside the town, Abbey Strury. So it's in a sense, you know, maybe it's not exactly appropriate to say it, but it's our own Auschwitz, if you like. It's our own Holocaust, and it's very much crystallises here in Skibbereen. And obviously this year was the first National Famine Commemoration. It will move to the west of Ireland next year. It will rotate by province. And certainly the people of Skibbereen and West Cork have certainly set a very high standard for remembering the victims of the famine.
In a contemporary setting, do you find in parts of the world where there is a more recent memory of famine, does that leave all sorts of psychological scars and societal scars?
Of course. And I suppose that was the other thing that Minister O'Keefe, in initiating this formal National Commemoration Day, was anxious to ensure that it wasn't just about reflecting on the tragedy of the Irish famine, but it was also about reflecting on famine and hunger in the world today. And in fact, last week in Gorta, we launched a new website, which is makehungerhistory.org. And in that, we have people from all around the world giving short sort of sound bites in terms of their own impressions of hunger and their own ideas as to how we go about solving it. And even last night I was at the play, The Flight to Gross Eel, and, you know, thinking about the coffin ships. And in a modern day setting, you know, there are coffin ships in the Mediterranean sailing from North Africa. There are others on the Atlantic, again, sailing from North and West Africa, and in other parts of the world where people are leaving dire circumstances and going to where they feel there is a better world. And those ships, again, are overcrowded, boats that are overcrowded, ridden with disease, and so many people perish along the way. And that's, again, as you said, 160 years on, in a sense that history repeats itself.
In a recession, is that message, your message there, doesn't have as many ears, I would imagine?
Well, you'd be very surprised. I mean, I'm not sure if you remember, if you like, what we'd call the last recession in Ireland, but going back a decade or two, and at the time I was involved as a fundraising volunteer with Gorta, and even in those days, and you would see people giving generously, even though you would know that they were in difficult circumstances themselves. And we see that today too, that people still continue because they realise that even though we have difficult circumstances in Ireland, that there are people so much more worse off. I mean, in the world today, we probably lose 10 million children a year under 5 years of age because of hunger and disease, The basics of life, food and water, that we take for granted are denied to about 1 billion people in the world. Safe, clean water and a regular supply of food. So when we look at our own circumstances against those, and Irish people traditionally have been very generous, whether it's the tsunami or whether it's just the ongoing work that Gorta does, because we believe, for example, that the answer for Africa and for the poorest parts of Africa is not to give people food. Of course it's necessary in times of famine and that we get emergency relief.
But to give them the wherewithal to do it themselves.
But it's about growing food, it's helping people to grow. And we have used the Chinese proverb since Gorta was established in 1965, that if you give someone a fish, you feed them for a day, but if you teach them to fish, you feed them for life. And
Brian, I'm afraid sorry to cut over you, but we have to leave it there. We're out of time. Brian Hanratty, CEO of Gorta, thanks a million for talking to us.
Thanks indeed, Seán.
Joe in Wexford says the famine was genocide. The British government of Lord John Russell actually closed down the soup kitchens set up by the previous Tory Prime Minister Robert Peel. Charles Trevelyan, in charge of government policy on the famine, ordered grain ships heading for Ireland to turn around. When a similar famine had happened in 1741, the old Irish Parliament banned agricultural exports, bringing the famine to an end within a year. Says Joe. Another texter says documents came out on the details about the shipping of food out of Ireland under gunpoint. This was deliberate genocide, not famine. This has never been properly acknowledged. Says another texter. It is, though Kelly and Galway says, it is terrible to describe the famine as our Holocaust. This only contributes to our sense of national victimhood, says Kelly. Well, if you take into account an eighth of the population that more or less was killed by this, an eighth of the population, that's as a proportion, that's an extraordinary amount of people, and probably in European history unprecedented. We were talking as well, especially when we were talking to Brian Hanratty there from Gorta about helping people who are starving overseas. Terry says, fine words, but they sound hollow when one realises that the government has cut its aid budget by some 28%. We seem to be remembering our famine by paying lip service to others. The extent of the cuts is inexcusable, especially in light of last year's Hunger Task Force report, says Terry. Well, indeed. And I couldn't help but notice now, I'm not blaming Brian Hanratty because he has to be a bit political about these things, but when I asked him about your message may fall on deaf ears given recessionary times, he talked about the response of ordinary people, but he pointedly did not talk about, and we ran out of time then, but he pointedly did not talk about the response of government. You might have different feelings on that. Also we wondered as well about people in fishing communities during the famine. How did they fare? And again, we've got a variety of theories as to how they fared. Nolan Galway says the reason people didn't fish during the famine is that the fish were too far out for the boats of the time. Not sure why that was, but they did try to fish. Also, most of the deaths were from famine-related disease, not hunger, says Noel. The historian says fishing communities during the first year of famine used the timber from their boats to make coffins so that people could have a decent burial. Sorka in Connacht, Martin in Waterford says fish wasn't seen in the same way during the famine. Locally it was swapped for bread from the poorhouse, i.e. thrown over the wall. Then Christopher says, I heard that coastal communities sold their nets in the winter, and when potatoes failed, they could not afford to buy them back during the summer. And Sorka in Connacht says, my great-grandfather was born before the famine. I'm glad he survived. I have visited the famine burial ground where we think some of his siblings were buried. We should all remember and visit the graves on Memorial Day, says Sorka. That's extraordinary that you'd know your family tree back that far, and to think about your great-grandfather surviving those times.